Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Well, it appears spring has sprung here in New York City, and it's so nice to see so many of you out tonight. As a reminder, we have just 2 more forums coming up. Our next one on April 24th, Guns and Money, Tracking Underground Funds in a Borderless Economy. We welcome you back on April 24th for that. But tonight we have an interesting, very interesting topic, immigration backlash, labor migration in crisis. And in just a minute, I will have our moderator introduce tonight's guest panelists. I'm also pleased to let you know that Foreign Policy magazine has given us a gift. You may all pick up your copy if you haven't already up at the registration desk. There is an interesting interview inside with none other than Doris Meissner, who is on our panel tonight. So I hope you'll pick up the copy and take it home and read it. We're also very pleased tonight to have with us a regular guest at the Reuters Forum, David Schlesinger, who is now head of news here in New York City for Reuters, and it's always a pleasure to have anyone from Reuters here, especially since they sponsor the Reuters Forum. So welcome to all, and I'm now going to introduce Steve Schiffers, who will be handling the rest of tonight's program. Don't let Steve's British accent fool you. He was actually born in New York City and raised in New Jersey, but he's become a British file because he lived so long in London. He was here in New York. I had the pleasure of knowing him when he spent a year as a Knight Bagehot Fellow in the class of 93, 94. He now runs BBC's online website and has been a business journalist forever. I'm not going to take up, you can read his bio, of course, on the back of your flyer, so I'm not going to take up any more of his time. I'm going to let Steve introduce the rest of our speakers.
Thank you all for coming. I'd just like to say a few words, first of all, about this very important topic we're discussing tonight. Globalization, I think, is perhaps even more important in a post-September 11th world. And immigration and migration are some of the most important issues facing us in a globalized world. Just to remind you some of the facts, there are, according to the UN, more than 100 million migrants or immigrants every year who move around the world. The US receives the largest number of immigrants of any country, and nearly 30 million new immigrants have moved to the United States since 1970, provoking a lively debate even before the events we'll be discussing tonight. The Immigration and Nationalization Service, which is the body charged with regulating the flow of immigrants, faces a very difficult task, and as we know, its restructuring is being discussed in Congress. There are some 500 million entries every year to the United States, 6 million green card applications, 100,000 refugees admitted, 1 million criminal investigations, and 170,000 deportations. So that's just something about the scale of the task facing the Immigration Service in deciding what to do in a world where we now perhaps are feeling that more insecure than ever and feeling that the task of immigration is harder than ever, finding the border between providing security for the country and providing that open approach to immigration, which of course the United States was founded on. And luckily we have a very distinguished group of panelists to discuss these issues. We'll be joined tonight by Randy Hammoud, who's a civil rights lawyer from San Diego. Mr. Hammoud was thrown into the issues relating to September 11th when he took on 3 clients who were young Arab Muslim men arrested as material witnesses in a post-9/11 dragnet. One of them is still in detention, one is free on bail, and one has been found to have no connection to any of the events and has been released. Since his involvement, he's been a very outspoken advocate and has raised the questions, really, that we need to consider about the civil rights implications of 9/11 for how we will regulate immigration in the future. David Schlesinger, who we've who's already been introduced, is the Executive Vice President of Reuters for the Americas, which means he covers both North and South America, leading a team of 650 journalists, cameramen and photographers. Mr. Schlesinger started his career actually covering China and the Far East. His first job was a high school teacher in Hong Kong before beginning a distinguished career as a journalist, and he had 13 years in the Far East before moving back to the United States. Dr. Ziad Asali is president of the Arab American Discrimination Committee. He assumed the presidency just 1 month before the events of September 11th and has faced a difficult task since then in trying to ensure that the civil rights of Arab Americans are not negatively affected by the fears and concerns that followed the terrible events of that month. He was born in Jerusalem and is a graduate of the American University of Beirut Medical School, but he's been a practicing doctor in the United States for many years and was medical director and chairman of the board at Christian County Medical Clinic near Springfield, Illinois, until he retired last year. And finally, we're very pleased to be joined by Doris Meissner, who was the Commissioner of Immigration and Naturalization in the Clinton administration. Ms. Meissner was in charge of a very important series of reforms in that period, including changes to the asylum system, new strategies to manage the borders of the United States, particularly with Mexico and Canada, in the context of the NAFTA agreement, and managing humanitarian and migration crises that occurred during her period in office. She has a long and distinguished career in the Department of Justice, but was also in between influential in founding the Carnegie Endowment's Program on International Migration, which has now become its own think tank. And since retiring from the post as commissioner, she's returned to the Carnegie Endowment, where she's now a senior associate. So I'm very pleased to welcome the panelists. We'll have short statements from each of them in order, and then we'll open the floor to questions, which they'll be able to respond. Hopefully we'll have about an hour for questions. But first I'd like to hear from Mr. Hammoud. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to begin matters lightly with a joke, but I'm not in a very joking mood. I arrived in New York a couple of days ago, and yesterday you might have read in the newspapers that an attorney who's representing or has represented in the past a gentleman named Sheikh Abdul Rahman has been indicted by the government of the United States for allegedly passing terrorist messages from her client at prison to alleged henchmen on the outside. I consider that to be an abject attack by Attorney General Ashcroft against the defense counsel across the United States, against any lawyers intending to defend any suspected terrorist or detainee who might be of Middle East persuasion. It will have a chilling effect by definition. I looked at the charges. I haven't read the indictment. I noticed that they relate to incidents that allegedly occurred in October of 1999, April, May, and June of 2000. Why it took the Attorney General's office so long to charge this lawyer with these alleged egregious violations, I do not actually know, but I suspect there's more spin. I've been involved in the maelstrom of September 11th since, as all of you, September 11th. Although my role has been a little different. I found myself representing 3 young Arab men who were arrested in San Diego as material witnesses. So there will be no doubt about their situation. None, I repeat, none has been alleged to have had any ties with any of the planning for the events of September 11th or Al-Qaeda or any terrorist connections whatsoever. The 2 who basically remain under charges by the federal government, one of them faces charges that he allegedly lied about an immigration asylum application in May of 2000. The other, Mr. Awadallah, was here in New York. He testified as a material witness before a grand jury. He became confused about some testimony regarding the identity of a person and also the authorship of a document. Even though he rehabilitated his testimony, he's been charged with 2 counts of lying to the grand jury. none of which applies to any terrorist links or terrorist-related activities. The point is, they're Arab men, they're under these charges and cloud or stigma because of their ethnicity and because of the terrible events of September 11th. One of the questions I think today is, has there been a change in immigration policy since September 11th? Yes, without any question, there's a new paradigm. I'm an example of it. I represent the best and the worst of immigration policy in the United States. In the 1920s, my grandparents came here, no skills. They brought a new culture, a new religion, new foods, and something very important to this country at that time, a work ethic. 2 generations later, and they weren't educated either, by the way, but they brought work and they brought loyalty to the country and industry, and they brought potential families. I'm a product of that, okay? 2 generations later, I'm an attorney. I went to UCLA Law School, a respected member of society and a contributing member of society, I think. However, today, in today's environment, my grandparents would not be welcome to this country. They would be young people, they would be discouraged from immigrating. The INS since September 11th has become a weapon of oppression rather than a weapon of, rather than a facilitator of immigration. It's an instrument of immigration with an E. Secret detentions characterize INS arrests. We have several hundred Arab men today who are in custody who we don't know who they are or where they are. We don't know their welfare. We don't know if they have attorneys. We don't know what their future holds for them by edict of the United States government. We have secret INS hearings, which is a violation of due process of law, and a courageous judge has just rendered that decision within the past 3 days, I believe, to the effect that although the Attorney General's office and Judge Cuppy has ordered that INS proceedings relating to basically Arabs and Muslims in the Middle East be sealed. That's not right. They have to have these trials out in public where they can be seen. We have the Attorney General's office demanding to interview legitimate immigrating or visiting Arabs and Muslims who've come into the country since January of 2000. First group 6,000, last group approximately 3,000. They have these interviews, and as happens, they come forward to interview on occasion without counsel. I have a client who called me just this week about that. He gave information to the FBI, and then an INS officer walked in, said there's some problem with the visa, and they arrested him. When they arrest Arabs in the Middle East now, and there's a list of 25 countries, are basically Muslim or Islamic countries, they're held without bond, no bail holds, because of their ethnicity. There is a new paradigm, anti-immigrant. The country is anti-immigrant, it's xenophobic relative to my ethnic group, Arabs, Muslims, Middle East. Whether it will spread like a cancer to other ethnic groups, I can't guarantee that it will, but I suspect that it will. I suspect that if it weren't for the fact that of the 8 million or so undocumented people in this country, a lion's share of them are Hispanic, and there's a large Hispanic vote, that neither of the political parties would be schmoozing the Hispanic vote and talking about amnesty for Hispanic or Mexican immigrants, because they would just basically want to get rid of them too. You can take a look at the bestsellers list here in New York. You can take a look at American Jihad, a hit piece against Islam by a historic Israel apologist named Steve Emerson, whose claim to fame before September 11th was stating on nationwide TV a few minutes after the terrible bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City that Arab terrorists were responsible for that heinous act. We have Pat Buchanan's book, The Decline of Western Civilization. He attributes it to immigration. So a country of immigrants is no longer a country of immigrants. It's a country of people who don't like immigration. One of the catchwords recently, I think, has been globalization. What's it mean? To me, it means opportunities for fellows like George Soros to exploit local currencies and to destroy local economies. To me, it means opportunities to create sweatshops in Bangladesh and other places so Mikey and other companies can put their stripes on the shoes and sell them here. To me, it means environmental destruction because environmental laws in this country might be too difficult to contend with in this, quote, global, close quote, economy. But also, to me, it also means it's an anti-immigrant concept. No longer do you need immigrants to come to your country to benefit your country because of cyberspace, the global communications network, you can exploit in situ. So the immigrants don't have to come here anymore, so we can take advantage of their labor and apply their ethic, their work ethic here. We can do it abroad and not be bothered with them. I think that's happening. But however, if we happen to have some skill shortage, then we'll be glad to drain off the skilled people by giving certain work visas for people with special skills to take them out of those third world countries where we exploit the local population by training them enough to perform jobs that would be higher paying here, but that we want performed over there. So I think some people may call it a clash of civilizations. I call it a clash of rote economics. It's a very capitalist-driven, cynical, if you will, society in which we find ourselves after the Cold War's demise. There's no reason for anybody to prove him or herself better than the other fellow or more moral than the other fellow, as there was in the bifurcation between the East and West after post-war, in the post-war world. Now it's the most basically economic efficient or possibly the richest fellow who's the one that counts the most. So I think globalization in itself breeds anti-immigrant feelings in the developed countries, especially this one now. September 11th has been a catalyst, I think, for a whole movement towards the reduction and elimination of immigration and the conversion of what we call immigration to immigration with an E. And it's a very bothersome time to me and my ethnic group, and I think we would be categorized as the first of several to follow. I think it is food for thought. I think the historic benefits of immigration that made this country great, that allowed my grandparents to come here and make this country great, are now occluded and clouded over by the concepts, well, we don't need unskilled people anymore, we just need the skilled people to come here, we just need small numbers of them to make up for our own labor pool. And as soon as we train enough scientists and computer technology people, then we won't need them anymore either, so we don't need immigrants. So it's a global economy. I think it's going to be an economy of discrete, exploited local peoples until such time as there's a single market and a single currency worldwide, which we don't have. And I think immigration is going to be the early victim of that. And September 11th was merely a catalyst that happened to fall upon my people's shoulders, tragically. And I don't see any light at the end of our tunnel at this particular time. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Dave, thank you for that.
Thank you. As the journalist on the panel, my role is to take somewhat more of an overview of the situation, but it's certainly difficult to take a more an emotional overview after following such a heartfelt speech by Mr. Hamoud. But even as a journalist who's supposed to take the more objective view, I find that I am very much part of this story. I work for Reuters, the company which makes its living as part of the globalization trade. We make our living trying to explain one culture to another. We make our living by having journalists in every country in the world trying to tell the stories objectively, but often struggling by being part of the story ourselves, by being in areas which are full of emotion, full of tumult, full of problems. I myself am the first person in my family to be born in the United States. My wife was the first person in her family to be born in Hong Kong, and now she's a naturalized American. So like many of us, I'm part of the immigration story. We are a nation of immigrants. In the United States, 10% of the population is foreign-born. 20% of the population is of foreign stock, meaning that they're either foreign-born or have at least one foreign parent. So 1 out of 5. So when we talk about immigration backlash, I think we have to be very careful that we're not just taking a slice of time right around the horrific events of September 11th. I think it's very important that we look at the big picture, the picture where the proportion of immigrants in foreign-born people in the United States has doubled from 4.7% in 1970 to that 10.4% that I just talked about. And when you have 20% of the population now of foreign stock, and if you have the fact that people of foreign stock are actually, that those family sizes are growing faster, then pretty soon you cannot have an immigration backlash because of the proportion of people in the country who have a personal stake in the immigration question. I think we have to be very careful to separate out questions of discrimination questions of anti-Arab prejudice, which there certainly are right now. We have to separate those particular questions from the broader question of, is there a problem with immigration? Is there a problem with the United States' feeling towards other countries and welcoming people from other countries? I think when you look globally, what you have to focus on is the fear of the other, the fear of the unassimilated, the fear that comes from economic hard times and from fear of crime. And I think you have to separate those, you have to isolate what are the factors that cause people to have either an anti-Arab feeling or to pass anti-immigration laws or to have other factors with, in elections or in political polls that then can be interpreted as just a backlash against immigration writ large. I think you run into trouble when you try to put everything into one pot. What we have after the events of 9/11 is very much a lashing out, a feeling of powerlessness. So what can we do? We can attack an ethnic group. What can we do? We can attack a government agency, which through certainly faults of its own has been a magnet for attack. But these lashing out, this momentary lashing out in the wake of 9/11, I think you have to put into the broader historical context, which is growing immigration in the United States and the growing globalization worldwide, which I think is going to lead to not an immigration backlash, but is going to make immigration, in fact, worldwide, a very natural thing. And as time goes on, as the proportion of people who have a personal stake, both here in the United States and worldwide, have much more of a personal stake in the free flow of people, just as they have a stake in the free flow of money, the free flow of ideas, the free flow of goods. I think what you will have is not an immigration backlash, but you'll have immigration assimilated much more into the fabric of the world.
Thank you very much. Dr. Osley.
Thank you very much. I guess I'm the only true immigrant on this panel. And I'm going to read out of a prepared text, perhaps because I'm an immigrant. My message to you today is that through a series of new policies and practices introduced since the appalling terrorist attacks of September 11th, our government has, in subtle but insidious ways, reintroduced an element of ethnic discrimination into our immigration policies and law enforcement practices. I will demonstrate this to you by tracing a thread through several new practices, each of which would be rationalized or tolerated as an aberration when taken on its own, but which taken together amount to a pattern of ethnic discrimination that should be troubling to all Americans. Everyone agrees that homeland security is an important priority in the wake of these despicable attacks, and everyone also agrees that due attention should be given to reforming the processes by which visitors to the United States come into and stay in our country. Our point is that these practices need to be colorblind, so to speak, and they must not be allowed to reflect a pattern of official bias. I have in mind particularly 4 practices that reveal a consistent pattern of thought that amounts to systematized discrimination. The first of these is the secret detention in facilities around the country of hundreds of men, mostly Arabs or Muslims. These are not accused or even suspected of involvement in any form of terrorism or having knowledge of any form of terrorism. They are simply Arab or Muslim men picked up since 9/11 who are in some way, including extremely trivial ways, out of status. The policy of the INS, as expressed in these detentions, seems now to be that if you are an Arab or a Muslim who is out of status in any way whatsoever, you will be detained indefinitely without bond and deported. Other non-citizens with similar technical visa problems are not being incarcerated in this draconian manner or departed for trivial reasons. The case of the Pakistani man, Ansar Mahmood, whose unjust deportation was the subject of a blistering editorial attack in the Washington Post, illustrates how harsh and unfair these deportations can be. Moreover, we have no way of knowing how many people are being held under such circumstances, since the government will not release this basic information and refuses to comply with FOIA requests made by ADC, ACLU, and 20 other organizations. One thing we do know, however, is that these men would not be in jail if they had a different ethnicity or religious affiliation. Secondly, I would cite that the investigation in thousands of young men, again mostly Arabs, based on their age, national origin, gender, and time of entry into the United States. The government initially sought the interview of 5,000 people based on these broad categories, and now seeks to investigate an additional 3,000 more. We strongly feel that this amounts to a form of racial profiling, since the criteria are so crude and broad-based. We note that the government is using these so-called voluntary interviews to find and arrest additional people who are out of status. The information gathered in this manner is being collected in a nation database, which suggests that the whole point of the exercise is to collect and maintain detailed dossiers on people of certain description, to wit, young Arab men. No comparable effort to investigate any similar group of non-citizens in the United States exists, as far as we know. Thirdly, I would point out that the prioritization of finding the presumed Middle Easterners among the 315,000 or so absconders, persons ordered deported but who remain in the country, again demonstrates a clear bias. The move to add the list of absconders to the National Crime Database is part of a broader effort to bring regular police and law enforcement into immigration law enforcement activities that have heretofore been the provenance of the INS. But by adding 6,000 presumed Middle Easterners and others among the 300,000 afterwards, the government is placing a priority on removing a group of absconders based on their ethnicity. Finally, I would say that the new visa screening procedures, where males aged 16 to 45 from Arab states and other Muslim nations will have to answer a special questionnaire in addition to the one required of all applicants and wait an extra 20 days, is a clear policy of discrimination. I would argue that by connecting the dots, so to speak, by examining these policies together, the detentions, the investigations, the absconders, and the new visa screening rules, a pattern of coherent, systematic discrimination begins to emerge. Essentially, we have recast our immigration system to involve two completely different standards, one for young Arab males and another for everyone else. The thinking behind these practices is clear and consistent. Young Arab males are now considered by our government to be, by definition, suspicious, potentially dangerous, and of interest to the authorities. This idea, moreover, cannot be contained to these policies in the long run. If we allow it to take root in our policies, it may well authorize similar forms of discrimination in many other instances. This is particularly disturbing given new powers for state, local, and federal law enforcement or to enforce immigration laws. It is our understanding that the Justice Department is about to release a legal opinion that will say that states and localities have the inherent authority to reinforce immigration laws. This will presumably clear the way for local police agencies that wish to do so to arrest and detain persons both based on suspected immigration law violations, apparently without undergoing training in immigration laws and policies. We're already receiving reports of university students being stopped on campus by campus police and subjected to questioning about their visa status. There is every danger that this new approach, if not handled with the greatest possible care, will bring us one step closer to becoming a police state or to develop into a witch hunt against persons who appear to be of Arab ethnicity. Moreover, anytime the government itself is seen to be acting in an inherently discriminatory fashion, it tends to authorize others in society to discriminate as well and reinforce prejudices that produce various forms of discrimination and even hate crimes. Some argue that altering the immigration system to include anti-Arab discriminatory practices is warranted by September attacks. I would certainly argue it is not. Acting in the name of national security based on such crude stereotypes, painting millions of people with a broad brush of suspicion based on flimsy profile of age, gender, and ethnicity, will not enhance our security. It will divert scarce law enforcement and security resources away from truly effective measures that deal with actually existing security threats towards thousands of people about whom there is no rational reason to be concerned. I'm glad to say that there are many in the law enforcement and counterterrorism field who agree with us on this point. As Vincent Canestrano, the former head of counterterrorism for the CIA, has pointed out, ethnicity is a false lead. In other words, it does not tell you anything useful about whether or not someone can reasonably be regarded as suspicious. We are gratified, but not surprised, that opposition to the Dragnet investigation was widespread in the law enforcement community, to the extent that a number of local police chiefs simply refused to allow their officers to be involved in a project that struck many of them as indefensible, not what the police should be doing, and in some places even in possible violation of local law or consent decrees. The idea that introducing discriminatory practices into our immigration system will bring us greater security simply does not stand up to scrutiny, although it may have a certain emotional appeal. And while it does not promise to seriously improve security, it certainly diminishes us as a society committed to non-discrimination and fairness. At the very least, we should be honest with ourselves about what ideas inform our immigration practices and what message is sent by them. We have a long history of racism and discrimination in our immigration laws and policies in the United States, but we eliminated them entirely some 50 years ago. Are we going to allow ourselves to be bullied into reversing this and returning to a system that incorporates discrimination and injustice as a part of its basic structure? I'm afraid that we have been drifting dangerously in that direction in the past 6 months. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. Ms. Meissner, please.
Thank you. The core question that has been given to us for this debate, the question of whether immigration has been fundamentally changed by the events of 9/11, has been touched on in different ways by each of us. I would answer that question along with most, I think, of the speakers by saying absolutely yes. I think the debate has changed in very significant ways. And a number of those ways have already been talked about. The basic change, as I see it in the debate, is that we have now been forced to confront immigration as an issue, as a phenomenon in our society that has very substantial security dimensions to it. And that is something that has always been a characteristic of immigration, but it is something that we have essentially glossed over for most of the last recent years, and I would argue have pretty much glossed over for the last 20, 30 years, but certainly for the last 10 years. Fundamentally, we have been treating immigration as an economic phenomenon, and we have been seeing it through the lens of our economy and through the lens of the contributions that immigration makes to our economy. Those contributions are by and large very positive and are very much a part of the story of the incredible economic success of this economy in recent years. But we have been quite unwilling to look at the complexity of immigration. Now we are forced to do that with 9/11 because 9/11 shows us that there is a very substantial security dimension to immigration, along with the issues that surround the economy and other characteristics of immigration. So the debate, in my opinion, has changed in a fundamental way, in a way that is a paradigm shift, and in a way that that demands all of our attention. But I don't think that that change in the debate is translating into a change in the fundamentals of immigration, in the fundamentals of our immigration policy or of our commitment to continuing to be a nation of immigrants. Now, I think there are a variety of ways of illustrating that point. Let me just tick off a couple of them. If you look at the legislation that the administration sent to the Congress right after 9/11, the very first piece of legislation that the administration sent was basically asking for war powers. And the Congress passed that within a week. I mean, most of us don't even know what happened because it just happened. But the second piece of legislation that was sent was immigration legislation. And it was the legislation that is the source of the issues that are being talked about here, because what it resulted in was quite a substantial, relaxation or broadening of the power of the government to detain non-immigrants. However, the form in which that legislation went to the Congress was considerably broader than what it was that was actually enacted. And I think most of us in the field were very, very fearful that that immigration legislation would just get rubber stamped in the way that the, what I call war powers legislation did. But in fact, it's quite interesting. That legislation got slowed down to the point that the administration had to begin to sort of have a temper tantrum and stamp its feet. You know, you gotta do this, national security, et cetera, et cetera. But there were voices in the Congress, and there were very substantial voices, even in the aftershock of that immediate aftershock of 9/11, that forced the political system to look carefully. And even though those provisions that were passed are, I would agree, being misused, they are far more contained than what it was that the administration was looking for and that we were in danger of having enacted. So there was right at the outset, where immigration is concerned, some pretty important red flags that went up and that resulted in some degree of restraint given the circumstances. Now, the real misdeeds and the real areas of concern to me are not what has happened in the legislative arena, which is obviously the most worrisome, because once your laws change, it's very hard to change them back. It is what it is that this administration is doing with not necessarily even its new authorities, certainly its new authorities where detention are concerned, but with other very, very broad authorities that already exist in the immigration laws. And immigration law is a very, very heavy, very strong tool when the government wants to use it to its fullest extent. And that is certainly what is happening, and that is certainly what, what we need to be concerned about as a society. But even proposals like the proposal that was made by Senator Feinstein, where foreign students were concerned, to establish a total moratorium, simply stop bringing foreign students into the country, we've got to get a hold of this thing. She got pushed back immediately, and that lasted for about a week. And it was very, very clear that the interests of broad sectors of the society in maintaining the fundamentals of our immigration system and the fundamentals of a generous immigration policy in terms of levels of immigration was not going to be upended after 9/11, based on 9/11. So instead, the focus has shifted to what I think of as a whole set of administrative issues. Some of them have been referred to, but they are basically the issues of what about our data systems? What can we and should we be doing to track people more effectively? Why aren't we getting why isn't the government getting the kind of cooperation from airlines, from the higher education establishment, from all kinds of elements of society that need to work together more effectively? What about the funding for these things? How come our visa system missed being able to identify people like this? How does intelligence information flow within the government? How is it shared? How is it not shared? What needs to be changed to do that? These are all very important issues, and they are all things that need to be addressed, and they should not have broken down, many of them, to the extent that was revealed in 9/11 and after that. But they are, how do you run things? How do you manage things? They are not questioning and shifting the basic fundamentals, as I say, of our immigration system today and its place in our society. And I think that along with that has come an overall public reaction that I would not have expected. I think that overall, in the course of our history, when there have been spectacular occurrences, such as what happened on 9/11, those of us who have been in this field expected a huge immigration backlash and expected there to be a real across-the-board public response against immigration. And it did not happen. Now, some of my panelists will have disagreed on this point, but I would argue that it did not happen, that essentially there certainly are problems, there are issues of discrimination that are serious issues, and those are, and they are unacceptable, and that needs to change. But that is different from an immigration backlash. So I think that I associate myself with those who have said that we have not seen an immigration backlash, and I think that that actually is quite a responsible and a sophisticated answer, thing to have seen on the part of the public. Now, I think that there are some very interesting and important reasons that explain that. And I would divide those reasons into two categories, the politics of immigration today and issues of the demographics and how immigration fits and works for us as a society today. Where the politics are concerned, you have right now in the presidency the part of the Republican Party that has been traditionally very pragmatic and positive toward immigration. The Bush part of the Republican Party represents business interests, represents those parts of the economy that thrive from immigration, that understand the contributions that immigration makes. As compared to the conservative, culturally conservative part of the Republican Party, which is much more, which was represented by Governor Wilson in California in the mid-1990s with Proposition 187 and campaigning on an anti-immigrant platform, etc. That was immigration backlash. We had immigration backlash in this country in 1993, 94, 95, culminating in legislation in 1996, which is as harsh where immigration is concerned as and in many ways much more problematic than this recent act, it seems to me, that was passed right after 9/11. But that part of the Republican Party was discredited. It was discredited after that period in California, and it has not been able to come back to the fore, although you certainly hear the voices, and Pat Buchanan is one of those voices, etc. But fundamentally, you have in this administration the pragmatic wing of the party, and you have with that a Democratic Party that is made up of most major constituencies that are either heavily immigrant-oriented or very positive about immigration, even including in recent years the labor movement, which has traditionally been very wary of immigration and has come to be a strong supporter of immigration. So that the real debate politically that's going on in this country about immigration, yes, no, is a debate within the Republican Party. It's not a debate, I would argue, between Republicans and Democrats. It's a struggle for the hearts and minds of what the Republican Party believes about this. And it just so happens that with Bush being, you know, as I say, of the pragmatic wing, that tone was set and the administration did not take out after immigration writ large. More fundamentally, of course, that is a reflection of where we are demographically. And you've heard some of the numbers on that. We are a nation of immigrants as much as we ever have been in our history. We have just come through a decade, the 1990s, that constitutes the largest single decade of immigration in our history. More than 10 million people came here in the 1990s. It is not the largest percentage of our population. We're second as compared to the turn of the century from the 1900s to the 20th century. But the largest in overall numbers, that is a lot of people. We have become and are continuing to become a very, very diverse country, more diverse than we have ever been in our history. The first state now, California, that has been the strongest state of receiving immigrants is, as of the 2000 census, made up of a majority of what we think of as minorities. You can't really call it minorities anymore when it's the majority. But the point is that whites in California are now in the minority of the population. That will become the pattern quite quickly, probably by 2005, certainly by 2010, in at least Texas and Florida, probably, and New York, and then probably Illinois and New Jersey to follow. That is already the pattern in 50 of the 100 largest cities, urban areas in this nation. So we are transforming ourselves as we speak. And that is only likely to continue. It is likely to continue because of globalization. Globalization has its negatives, but globalization has many, many positive effects, not only for this country, but for other countries, certainly for this country. But because of globalization and the interconnections among marketplaces and economies around the world, the movement of people and the necessity and virtues of freer and freer flows are tied together. So that globalization, along with what our needs as a country are going to be in the future, will be the powerful engines of continuing immigration. We are an aging society without immigration. We are a society that will have strong, continuing labor market needs for immigrants in order to remain economically competitive. And there is no reason to believe, at least from what we know at this point, that any of those trends, that any of those fundamental directions will change in our lifetimes. So, as I see it, what is really happening is that there is a very, very intense struggle going on in our politics, in our public debate, in our own minds, in our thinking, about how to reconcile immigration as a historic and economic function of this society with immigration as a security concern, now a co-equal part of that mix and of that formula. Now, I am not terribly reassured by some of the people that are in government at the present time who we have entrusted to help reconcile that tension. But that is not to say that the definition of what it is that we're dealing with is wrong. And it is to say that strong voices and strong debate and seriously trying to work through the real intellectual as well as practical problem solving that's required to find new formulas it is obviously extremely important. There is no question that we have to find better ways to manage some of the practical issues. We do need to know more about who is here. We do need to force ourselves to have ways for people to comply with the terms of their visas and not have such a laissez-faire approach to when people come and go. We've got to do a much more aggressive job of building partnerships between government and other institutions in the society that are beneficiaries of immigration and that have to help and be engaged in regulating immigration. And we do have to face up in the longer term to the problem of undocumented immigration, because we have a very large undocumented population in this country, and if we need them for our labor markets, then we should confront that and find ways of regularizing those flows and bringing people above ground so that we don't continue in this hypocrisy of saying, well, we know you're here, but we're not going to do anything about it, if only because a more security-conscious time and needs will dictate that we know better who it is that's here and what the circumstances are that bring them here. So, in order to sum up, I would say absolutely the debate has changed. But I would also say that the fundamentals of immigration have not changed, that the underlying reality and the future for immigration to this country continue to be driven by the economy, they continue to be driven by our history and by our identity, and that we will continue to see immigration as a valuable element of our nation building. Thank you.
Thanks very much to all our distinguished speakers. We now open the floor to questions. Can I ask you, if you have questions, to come up to the two mics, either aisle. Also to give your name, say who you're addressing a question to, and try, if possible, to be brief so we can get as many questions in as possible. Please, sir.
Hi, my name's David Phillips. I'm a student here at the J School. My question is for Ms. Meisner. The debate seems to get tricky because the United States of America is actually two countries. It's America, which is a country... Okay. I think that it's a tricky debate to decide what to do with immigration because the United States of America is actually two countries. We have America, which is a country of ideas, democracy, freedom, things that we can extend to everybody infinitely. And then we have the United States, which is finite, which has finite resources. How do we make a policy that tries to do justice to both? We can't let everyone in, is basically what I'm saying.
Well, I don't think anybody would argue for letting everybody in. And we do have policies and we do have rules. The issue is how do you enforce those rules in ways that makes certain limits, which are only real, I mean, which realistically have to be the case, make those limits actually work properly. And we have, as we see out of 9/11, not done a good job with regulating and having discipline in the rules that do exist. Now, it is not easy because there are pressures. Many more people want to come than we are prepared to have or be able to have, even with this being a very generous country and a generous immigration policy. But that is the nature of an unequal world. And, you know, the really long-term answer here is, frankly, the answer that goes with the pressures to migrate. I mean, the long-term answer is that we've got to pay a great deal more attention to equity around the world, because we cannot solve the world's problems of poverty and persecution through our immigration policy. That has to be solved in many different ways. We do immigration because it meets our national interests, but not because it can fix everything that is wrong everywhere else in the world. That takes lots of other kinds of solutions.
Yeah, I thought your question was very interesting because you mentioned one one bipolar relationship between ideals and finite resources, these two ideas in conflict. And I think the whole immigration debate is filled with those things. The INS itself, on the one hand, it provides services to immigrants, on the other, it cracks down on immigrants. Society at large, on the one hand, some want cheap labor, want labor that will do jobs that nobody else will do. On the other hand, there's a fear that too many immigrants will drive wages down. On the one hand, you want to reunify families, you want to have you want to bring together more people like you, which means bringing in more people from other places. On the other hand, you have the fear of the other. So there are all sorts of duopolies going on here in conflict with one another in this debate.
Yes, I'd like to touch on the question of immigration as related to security. I just want to point out that the criminals who committed the attack on September 11, none of them was an immigrant. Although the debate now is defined as immigration versus security, which is fine. The other is that it is not exactly true that nothing happened institutionally to impact immigration from Arab and Islamic countries, because it is not the general question of immigration that's at debate. It is the particulars of it, and in this particular instant, it is the immigrants from Arab and Muslim countries. Today, this very day, we've learned that the lottery immigration, the numbers of people who have won is down by some 14%, 2,000 people less. And all of these 2,000 are from Arab and Islamic countries. So there is a disproportionate impact, a selective impact, even such a thing as the random lottery on this particular group. I mean, we cannot pretend that the problem doesn't exist as it applies to this one particular segment, and we have to face up to what it means and what it means globally and what it means for us as a society.
Well, may I comment? I think the 2000 census was a wake-up call to the dark forces in this country who don't want more immigrants in the country. I think that the sheer numbers of immigrants during the past 10 years that Ms. Meisner pointed out were staggering to certain elements in society. I think September 11th is a catalyst for that movement. I think the Pat Buchanan book is going to basically set the tone for the future debate, and as soon as the Republican Party and the administration finishes schmoozing with the Hispanic vote and gets what they think they can get out of that, they're going to tighten down the screws, because it is a country of finite resources. The young man is correct about that. We no longer have an expanding western border. We no longer have expanding, and shall we say, endless resources. And we can exploit in situ now in foreign countries rather than bring people here to allow them opportunities to contribute to industry, etc. And I think the country is looking at itself and saying it's our last gasp of, quote, mainstream, close quote, America to possibly preserve itself before the next census. So no, I think September 11th was a catalyst for a lot of these thoughts being implemented into action now.
Hi, my name is James Brown, I'm a student here as well. I've just got two quick questions. First one is, we've looked at the question so far from a very Amerocentric viewpoint, like whatever America does controls what happens with immigration, which is probably true, but I'd just like to put it out there, like, do you think there's ever a chance that, you know, stories filter back about detentions or whatever, that people would want to stop coming to America? Is that ever going to be a danger, or is that just such a small factor that it doesn't matter? And the second thing is to Mr. Schlesinger and Ms. Meissner, just don't you think that it's kind of being complacent, a little complacent possibly, talking about, you know, we're in this historical trend and immigration's going up, because that's what happened in the, you know, the early 1900s, and it stopped, you know, people stopped it. And so just to say that because it's such a huge thing, I don't know the exact factors, but it's figures, sorry, but it's comparable levels and percentages then and now. So, you know, as we've been pointing out, there are these trends saying you know, we need to crack down on immigration and our identities being threatened and so on. And so my point is, don't you think it's wrong to be complacent about that, because it's happened before and it could happen again?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that you have to look at the historical trends. What I would look at also, which I think is very applicable to the question we've been talking about tonight, is the internment of Japanese during World War II. A horrible incident in U.S. history, but very, very similar. So you have a backlash against a particular ethnic group. You have people, you had Nisei Sanzei, who third generation Japanese Americans who had never even been to Japan, couldn't speak Japanese, they were interned because of their racial characteristics. So you have a backlash against a particular group, but that also happened on the eve of the great immigration wave that we've had over the last 40 years. So I think you can have a particular prejudice, you can have a particular act of discrimination against a group and without it affecting the actual trends of immigration.
I'm sure you do not imply that the pain of that one particular group is to be endured for the public good.
I'm not saying that at all. I'm simply discussing a historical fact. I'm not qualifying it as good, bad, or indifferent.
But I think the young man pointed out accurately, there have been movements that have restricted, draconian restrictions on immigration during different periods of the country, which I haven't researched and other members of the panel may have more information about. So I don't see any reason why they can't occur again. And Senator Feinstein, I pointed out, the Democrat, and she was going to basically stop all student visas for a period of time. And what happened there was, I think, 1% of the campus populations across the country of foreign students, but they pay 10% of the fees, so she hit an economic chord that the schools all came forward and said, hey, wait a minute, we can't lose 10% of our student fees, so let's not go there.
But I think that's really the issue. I mean, the issue is, in my view, that barring something unforeseen, and that something, you know, certainly could happen, but given what we know now, the reasons that are sustaining, the reasons in our society and the institutions in our society that are sustaining high levels of immigration continue to be committed to that and have a very, very strong stake in continuing it. So, you know, of course, things can always change. I mean, and I'm not sure that the word is necessarily complacency. I mean, the reason that immigration came to such a trickle in the 1920s was the result of the First World War followed by Depression, and so the Congress legislated very, very severe restrictions. The Congress could do that again, they
were also racist driven too, though, weren't they?
Well, of course, but I mean, whatever, you know,
Okay.
they were driven by all kinds of factors. But I don't see that anybody can point to strong evidence where those kinds of impulses would come from today. Certainly events could take us there, but I would have a hard time putting my finger on them, and something as astonishing and horrible as 9/11 seems not, at least at this point, to have done that wholesale.
Could I help guide your finger? Just for something that's been bothering me is that there was an increase in the number of work visas through the Republican Party, et cetera, a year or two ago to allow skilled people to come in. Computer skills, things we lack because not enough of you students out there, I guess, are taking engineering and computer science courses, and we have to attract these people from abroad. But now, since September 11th, there has been a movement to restrict from not secret or top secret data banks and computer and science operations, but even classified or sensitive information like credit backgrounds, even hotel and airline reservation information. In other words, restricting immigrants from those sorts of jobs that they were recruited to perform in the first instance. And probably the initial restrictions will be towards Arabs and Muslims from Middle East countries because they're suspect right now. But if there's this movement of national security to restrict foreigners from that sort of information, will that not in fact be one of the impetuses towards this restriction on immigration generally? Because we won't need those people anymore because we don't let them work here to do that sort of work anyway.
Can I just comment from the chair also, as the question was asking about the international perspective from some of the experience that's been happening recently in Europe, where I'm based, where there has been a parallel and quite strong debate on immigration and asylum policy and restriction. Just as in the United States, the economic boom growth in Europe in the post-war years was driven partly by immigration. Europe as a whole now accepts almost as many immigrants or migrants as the US internationally, but there's both an economic debate and now a security debate that parallels the debate we're having here. And in some countries, particularly Germany, that debate is becoming of quite serious political significance given the German election that's coming up. And it's becoming, in some ways, ironically, a more polarizing issue in Europe than it has been, or it probably is now politically in the US, where there's actually is a political debate. Our political parties are now dividing quite significantly on immigration in a way that they weren't several years ago. And I should also add, there has been a similar parallel debate on civil rights implications of legislation that would lead to restrictions on the right and detentions. And in fact, I think broadly Europe was more reluctant to pass these laws than we were, although a number of countries have made similar changes, partly at the request of the US. Take a question over there now.
My name is Sarah Schaefer. I'm a journalism student, and I'd like to play devil's advocate, if I may, and I'd like to address my question to Mr. Hamoud and Mr. Asali. You have justifiably so expressed a lot of criticism for the tactics used by the U.S. government and the INS to look at immigrants in the wake of the September 11th attacks. But it seems as though no matter what the agencies would do to tighten security, there would be some groups crying foul. And given the fact that people involved in the September 11th attacks were university students, and some were here on I think, overstayed or questionable visas, or visiting visas, what would you suggest as a moderate way to take security into consideration without violating what you see as violating human and civil rights?
Yes, so first off, I want to repeat that none of these involved with the attacks were actually immigrants. So that is an important thing to note. The consideration that the immigrants somehow have to be singled out because they share the same background is entirely much too wide. And I come from a discipline that is medicine, where the primary principle from the Hippocratic Oath days is primum non nocere, primarily do no harm. What we have to do is in our emotional reaction to the disaster that struck the country is that just let's do something and you know, maybe we can isolate all these people and put them somewhere on a boat and send them to the moon or something. That is not doable. What that does exactly, and if I'm maybe allowed just some kind of an international context of this, is to play into the hands of those who have committed the crime in the first place, to pit these huge masses of people on religious and cultural and civilizational course of conflict. So if we react in kind to what they have tried to impose on us by isolating Arabs and Muslims in the United States and in the West in general, then that would precisely achieve their purpose and would make the whole world a less attractive place to live. So this is at the core of how we should be reacting to this. We should, in fact, deal with the problems that have generated those crimes and with the circumstances that have generated those crimes. I do want to commend the Commissioner on the question of, you know, equity in general in the world. And I also want to say that it has been a failure of intelligence, a failure of policy, and really a failure of comprehension. And we have to deal with those, all of these issues as we deal with this.
Well, your concern is more simply expressed, and I'm not being pejorative. It's like, you know, a bunch of Arab Muslims attacked us. Isn't it a good idea to go out and grab every Arab Muslim we can get a hold of just in case they want to attack us? Proof is in the pudding.
That's not what I said.
Well, I mean, that's essentially what you said. What do we do, in other words? And what they have done is they've incarcerated over 1,200 Arab Muslim men that fits the age criteria as possible potential sleeper cell members and or potential terrorists to see if they could possibly deter future acts of terrorism. First of all, the proof is of all those people they've incarcerated, not a one was found to be guilty of any connection to September 11th or any membership in Al-Qaeda. The one person who's been charged, Zacharias Masawe, was incarcerated on August 15th, a month before, almost a month before September 11th. So of the dragnet and all the resources spent in casting the dragnet and imprisoning these men, they've come up with zip because there was nothing there. Also, if you're going to think and act ethnically, then people like John Walker and John Reed are going to slip through the net because they weren't Arabs. Then they can very easily not appear to be Muslims or fanatical in their views. The best and the most reasonable approach to avoid continuing manzanars and internments of 1942 ad nauseum into the future is to take a close look at your intelligence information, properly look at the bad people that you've identified, the 19 hijackers that were identified, look where they've been, Hamburg, Germany, Malaysia, look who they've spoken with and look who they've met with and find the co-conspirators, just like you would a drug dealer. That's how you protect America. You don't protect America with a wide ethnic dragnet, because this country spent 214 years trying to teach people to get along with each other. And when you start this country down the road, as one of our speakers accurately pointed out, thinking ethnically again, racially again, and singling out an ethnic religious group for special treatment, pejorative treatment, then we've destroyed what we were on September 10th, and we're less of a country on September 12th. So that's my response to that. Thank you. I didn't mean to pontificate.
My name is Professor Lehman, School of Business, Hofstra University. It was very elegant, nonetheless. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you to all the speakers here. It is a very difficult issue. I wanted to return, I thought it was a very interesting question. The first question, that we have a bifurcated society, one in which we have the ideals, and second, in which we have limited resources. I hate to be overly idealistic, but we don't really have necessarily limited resources. The National Research Council did a very large study in the late 1900s just about the issue that you brought out. Is immigration good economically, culturally, or is it bad? And they crunched through all those numbers, and many of the numbers were, it's good. It's a good thing. And there's a lot of quality and quantitative issues that we can talk about in that. But I want to return to that. Unfortunately, I think the need for that study emerged out of the fact that we're a racist society, and there's much discrimination. Pre-9/11, including the 1900s, and here today in our great 21st century. There's racial profiling in the paper from police. There's Fortune 500 CEOs saying horrible things about blacks and Jews and Asians. So I think we have to really deal with the fact that immigration cannot be bifurcated from our notions about discrimination and racism. And it's very scary that the Bush administration, as you've said, is suddenly going to change the rules of the games for Mexican immigrants because they want the Hispanic vote. It's, you know, that is such political maneuvering that it frightens me rather than says, yay, at least some people are getting in. So I would like you to speak to that issue about, you know, I think you've said it very eloquently, more so than myself. There is a lot of racism and discrimination in pre- and post-9/11 immigration policy. Where do we as a community go from here to change that?
Let's start with Ms. Meister on that. Thank you.
Well said.
I concur. I mean, the issue of racism, discrimination, and prejudice, you know, is a fact of our history. It's probably a fact of every society that exists on Earth. I would argue that we probably, as a society, struggle harder with it, or are more, or let's say, are as bedeviled by it as any society today. But it you know, one of the questions is it inherent in human nature? And let's hope not. But you know, we certainly have not solved those problems. The difficulty in the immigration arena is that our immigration laws have a long history. Our immigration laws are essentially have have been part of the institutional structure of racism, if you want to be declarative about it in that way, in this country. I mean, the first immigration laws that were actually enacted after the naturalization statutes, the first immigration laws we ever had were naturalization statutes. After that, the first laws that we passed targeted ethnicities for exclusion, Chinese and Asian, in the late 1880s, and then culminated in national origins quotas after the First World War. And as was said here earlier, the Japanese internment was part of the internal security, machinery that had something to do with immigration, and all of those. And then we went to the ideological exclusions that had to do with communism and beliefs in anarchy, and so our immigration laws are replete with these problems. And only, as somebody else said, within the last 50 years, actually in 1965. Were those provisions washed out of the statutes. And that was part of President Kennedy's carrying the ideas of civil rights as fully through statutory review as possible to include changes in the immigration laws. So I view this as a perpetual struggle. And what my colleague has said here about the danger of putting us stepping back into those pathways is very real and very important given that history.
David? Yeah, I agree with Ms. Meiser very much that the history of the immigration laws are replete with racism. Racism that stems from the natural human fear of the other. But I think it's important also to keep in mind that what is the other has changed. I think it's an amazing statistic that now 51% of the foreign-born people in the United States are from Latin America. That's not a Democrat problem, that's not a Republican issue, that is because of where we are in our hemisphere. It's because we are now much more a full part of our hemisphere. Yes, there were the anti-Chinese laws, but now 25% of the foreign-born are from Asia. So the American demography has changed profoundly, and I think that is a constant process, it's an evolving process, and that serves to ameliorate some of the racism that has been in society. It doesn't help the Arab American problem at all because it's such a small slice of that picture, but when you have such huge numbers of Hispanic Americans, of Asian Americans now, that is changing attitudes.
Well, and those changes came about because of the 1965 changes in the law that opened immigration to groups that had been excluded.
Well, our concern, of course, is to learn from history. Our concern is always about the present and the future. What is unfolding right now is a major form of racism in this country. And if you watch TV, you would think that the middle name of any Arab is terrorist. And that is not a coincidence. That is a built-up prejudice and instant discrimination in everybody's mind, and it's internalized, and that reflects itself in policies in this country. And we know what is being proposed now by Ashcroft, no less, is another layer of complication of the life of Arab and Muslim immigrants, and it is going to be, barring something unusual, be tolerated and passed because the atmosphere of racism is so emotionally charged and permeating in this culture that it will do the damage that it's, and it will take us, some decades. And that is why we're here, and that's why we're talking about it now, so people actually have a certain degree of integrity as they discuss this question and understand that this racism cannot be encoded, should not be encoded, if we are going to be what we claim we are, whether we call ourselves USA or America.
I would just point out that I was smart enough to learn to speak Spanish, so I'm going to try and blend in whenever I can.
Hi, my name is Ben Pugsley. I'm an undergrad here. Ms. Meisner, I would agree that we certainly didn't have the wholesale immigration backlash that we could have had. But there has been a palpable backlash against the Arab community or the potential Arab immigrants, including, as Mr. Hammoud mentioned, the additional questions that single out immigrants from Saudi Arabia or other Middle Eastern states and then immigrants from everywhere else. Is that something that's appropriate, or do we need a colorblind immigration policy?
We actually, we need, of course, a colorblind immigration policy. This is, what you're talking about and what we are pointing to here are, by and large, actions on the part of the executive branch. There have not really been legislative changes that have introduced into the law new elements of immigration discrimination. But there are practices where the executive branch is exercising its discretion by selectively applying elements of a law that is that allows for enormous discretion. And it's, I believe, being used improperly in many instances. But that is more changeable than wholesale statutory changes. This item that was referred to here, for instance, of the Justice Department drafting an opinion that would allow state and local law enforcement officers to enforce immigration law, is a very, very dangerous trend. Those are the kinds of things that I think that this will get enough discussion. And this is an authority that was put into the law in 1996. We fought against it. We asked the Congress not to give us that authority. When we actually got the authority, we did everything possible not to implement it. And by that I mean we forced enormous local consultation and outreach among police agencies in order for them to understand what it really meant to be implementing the immigration law, because it's a very complicated law to implement. My prediction on this is, as Mr. Rosalia said, that local police departments, after a certain flurry of activity, will refuse. I mean, they will determine that it is not wise for them to exercise this authority. And that is the way these things get worked out. I mean, I am not a Pollyanna about these sorts of things, but it is only 6 months since September 11th happened. I mean, we are in a period of enormous churn as a society in trying to grope our way toward understanding a new reality where immigration is one of the central things that we are trying to, that we have to revisit.
Fred, we're almost out of time, so could I just have one last question from the person over there and then give each of the panelists a chance to respond both to that and more generally.
My name is Liz Goldhirsch. I'm a student at Columbia. And you guys spoke about the racial profiling and other arrests that are affecting the Arab American community. And given the secretive nature of these activities, how do you suggest that average Americans help to combat that?
I think you have to be vocal against it. I think Americans, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, people who have fought for their rights through the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s to get where they are in this country today, guardedly, but much progress, have to really be very vocal in their opposition to those sorts of tactics, because they were victimized by those same tactics for well over 200 years in this country, and they don't need to be revisited on another ethnic group, because then on the balance they may come back to roost at home again. And I think you need to be in touch with your opinion leaders, your elected representatives at all levels, not just at the federal level, the local level also, especially if police departments are going to be enforcing immigration laws. We might not want to go there as a first line of defense. And don't be afraid to stand up and fight it, because what's happened in my experience, and I've written an article and it's been published in the California Lawyer magazine. I brought some reprints that are out there and they'll run out, but if you want to read about how terrorized the Arab American community is, nobody really wants to defend suspected terrorists or fellow traveler terrorists or people who are Arab or Muslim descent, because they might be terrorists in the sense that, nobody wants to really help a bad guy, and I can understand that, or a bad gal. But at the same time, people also don't want to speak up against what's happening because they say, well, maybe there is a sleeper cell in the country, or maybe there are some sleeper terrorists here, maybe we ought to let the government run amok in case they stumble across some of them. You really need to be very brave with your vocalization of opposition to racial profiling, to ethnically discriminating against any group in the country for any reason, because it doesn't work in the long term and will cause egregious harm in the long term. And with respect to Arabs and Muslims now, if the United States has become embroiled and involved in a 40-year-old civil war in Colombia and take sides and kill Colombians and affect Colombian families down there, and we have millions of Colombians living in the country here, who can say that there won't be terrorism generated by those sorts of policies later? You can have a pandemic terrorist movement by various groups with axes to grind because the foreign policies of the United States have alienated them and they're already here in the States or coming into the States. So you can't think ethnically. You have to think fairness for everybody, reasonable policies. And let's not take this terrorism war to be an instrument of repression across the world to alienate us even more as a country from ethnic groups who are already represented here who might have an axe to grind later. Speak up and speak out loudly, that's what I'd say.
I think that it's important to bear in mind that immigration policies here in the United States and around the world are based on fears, on prejudices, and on economic realities. I think a lot of the things that we've talked about tonight stem from the horrific events of September 11th and also the confluence of a major economic slowdown. I think as there is some distance from September 11th and as the economy turns around, some of the harsher prejudices and the harsher discrimination against Arab Americans will be ameliorated, and I think that the longer term trends of immigration policy will continue.
I think the answer to this and all problems of discrimination and prejudice is the same. We all have to be part of the civil rights movement. It is our collective and individual civil rights that are being challenged, and we must fight this good fight on a political level and in the media and in court. And we all must understand that we individually have a contribution to make at all these levels, at these three levels, and we must do it, because if we don't do it, our civil rights, we are now a minority within a minority of a minority. We are dispensable, more or less. But it is your fight and ours together, and it is the civil right of the America, or the dream of the America that our friend was talking about, that's at stake, and we should get involved.
It's hard to add anything to that. I think I would say that it sort of easily slips off our tongues to say that we're a nation of immigrants, but we are a nation of immigrants. That's how we established ourselves, and that's how we will continue to have the incredible comparative advantage in the world that we do have. Immigration, I believe, is one of the most difficult things that we do as a society. We do it very imperfectly, but we really do struggle to try to do it. And we are one of the few societies in the world that, in fact, does approach it as an affirmative, overall positive characteristic. But it is a struggle, and it is a struggle because of the things that have been talked about here. And it probably always will be a work in progress, simply because of the incredible emotion and difficulty that it represents. But as I said, we are today transforming ourselves in the way that we have transformed ourselves several times in the past. Those things are never pretty when they're actually taking place. You know, it's that thing about you don't ever want to see legislation being written. It's the same as watching sausage being made. I mean, it is not easy to be in the trenches. But as a society, we are dealing with a peak period of immigration in our history. We are remaking ourselves, and we need to do the kinds of things that have been said here in order to be sure that it comes out right.
Thank you all very much.